Why don't the religious understand that every single one of their arguments fail? Because they don't care, that's why. But we do, and that's why we go through the trouble of debunking all of these silly claims. And even in those places with the best intentions, the arguments still devolve into absurdity. And this is absolutely no different, so let's get back to the grind. Welcome back to part 2 of Neil Shenvi's blog post asking if belief in God is irrational. And so far, at least in my opinion, the answer, it has to be yes, but I'm willing to give him a second shot. So far, it's all just been appealing to things that the religious really wish were true, but they just can't show that any of them actually are, and that's pretty typical, I think. I'm also not impressed by that, and I don't think you should be either. This is really where I'd love to see someone like Neil come back and try to justify their positions more, in light of my criticisms, but mostly when we get religious people in the comments, it's all, duh, you're wrong and God is gonna get you, and stupid stuff like that. If that's the best that you can do, then just save us all the trouble and don't bother. Don't make yourself a complete laughingstock. You do that enough already. Leave that to the professional apologists. That's kind of their job. So anyway, with that in mind, let's get back to it. Is premise 2 rational? The second premise of the moral argument enjoys even more support from atheists. For example, a recent survey of professional philosophers found that 56% were moral realists who believe that objective moral facts do exist. Notable atheists who insist that objective moral facts exist include Thomas Nagel, Michael Martin, Kai Nielsen, Louise Antony, and Sam Harris. And who cares? There was a time when pretty much everybody believed the earth was flat. They were just all wrong. Nobody gives a damn who believes anything. We care what you can prove, and this article isn't proving anything but that Neil is pretty damn gullible. Nobody cares. And this is kind of why a lot of philosophy is just bullshit, because most of it, not all, but most of it is just fee-fees. But I like it. I don't care. There is a way that we would expect the real world to work if moral realism was at all true. It just doesn't work that way. So out come the excuses from all sides who are just really comforted thinking that it should. But should isn't does, is it? Your comfort doesn't matter. You don't matter. Get the hell over yourself. The main argument used to support the existence of moral facts is the observation that moral realism is a deeply intuitive position. Again, who cares? A flat earth is a deeply intuitive position because everywhere you look, the ground looks flat, barring things like mountains and the like. Our experience suggests that it's flat. But that doesn't make it flat, does it? It's an oblate spheroid. And that's why the people don't matter. Only the evidence does. People are prone to be irrational and overly emotional. The evidence doesn't have those problems. It just is what it is. People can screw it up, though, with their interpretations. But the problem there is always the people. The data is just data. It just exists. Normal human beings seem immediately aware of a moral realm, that there exists objective categories of good and evil and right and wrong. And that's just a claim. And you'll notice he's trying to load his claim down with emotional language, right? This is incredibly common. Well, normal human beings, with the implication that if you don't agree with him, well, you're just not normal, are you? There's something wrong with you. And this is really, really common, not just with religion, but with humanity. It's an emotional defense mechanism, suggesting that you're right and anyone who disagrees, there's automatically something suspect about them. You always represent goodness and light, no matter what your position might happen to be. Just learn to look for this, and you're going to see it absolutely everywhere. That doesn't make any of it true. Even professed moral relativists find it difficult, if not impossible, to remain consistent with regard to their moral relativism. Actually, it's not, even though I'm not necessarily a moral relativist. I'm a moral anti-realist. Moral relativism isn't actually an anti-realist position, since a lot of relativists are perfectly fine requiring people to follow the laws and social mores of the country in which they live. It's more moral situational relativism. I simply reject the idea that there is anything more to morality than what humans have made up. There's just no evidence to support it, and an awful lot of evidence that shows that moral realism is just total nonsense. But that's kind of getting off track, so let's get back to the article. While many atheists might be uncomfortable appealing to intuition to support a philosophical view, there are many extremely basic beliefs which we hold for the same reason. For example, our belief that the external world actually exists, i.e., we are not living in the Matrix, or our belief that other people have first-person subjective experiences of pain and pleasure, i.e., they are not unconscious zombies, are both based primarily on intuition. Alright, first off, so what? Because whether anybody likes it or not, there just has to be a point at which we have to agree for the sake of agreeing to some of these fundamental questions. Otherwise, there is no point in continuing. We can't prove the universe exists due to the problem of hard solipsism. We can't prove that we exist either, or that other people exist for the same reason. It's all an assumption, and it will always be so, because there isn't any other real choice. We're all just 3-pound meat sacks in our heads, and our only access to a potential outside world is through senses that we know they're not completely reliable. So we have to start someplace and work from there. That's just the way it goes, like it or not. Secondly, however, once you get past those base assumptions, and like I said, they are absolutely assumptions, but once you get past that, we have to look at what we actually observe, what the universe actually looks like. The universe does not look as if moral realism is a thing, and that's why the religious have to keep making up excuses for why, well, it just doesn't quite look like it should if that was the case. That's the whole thing, though. The religious, and a lot of people, like I said, they just really like the idea. But really liking the idea doesn't make the idea true. You have to be able to provide corroboratory evidence for why this idea actually matches, actually corresponds with objective reality, which, as I said, is just an assumption anyway. And none of these people are even trying to do that. That's kind of a problem. No one can prove that these intuitions are true, but it seems ridiculous to insist that they are false. In the same way, moral realists would argue that the denial of such a basic experience as the existence of moral facts will always be less plausible than the affirmation that such facts exist. Nielsen summarized his position in this way. Okay, great. Before we get to that, though, I wanted to weigh in here. There is, of course, a third option, one that a lot of people just don't want to acknowledge. I don't state that those intuitions are true or that they are false. We just don't know, and not knowing is a valid option. It's not as emotionally comforting as a lot of people would like, but it is an option to be sure. But when you don't know a thing, you just don't know a thing. So pretending to know that thing for the sake of your fifis is pretty damn stupid. Now, a lot of people, perhaps even most people, go almost entirely with their emotions, and yes, I still think that's pretty dumb. But it is what it is, and here we just have to deal with it. A lot of people, theists and atheists alike, they let their emotional state run wild, and their personal desires color their perceptions of reality. And it's kind of hard not to, I admit. However, if you recognize that that's what's going on, you can take steps to stop it or at least limit it to the best of your ability. And that's why you have to ask why a lot. Why do I think this? Why do I believe this? What supporting evidence outside of my own head do I have that suggests that this idea is actually factually correct? And most people don't do that. Most people are just idiots. Don't be an idiot. It's really not that hard to avoid it. It is more reasonable to believe such elemental things as wife-beating and child abuse to be evil than to believe any skeptical theory that tells us we cannot know or reasonably believe any of these things to be evil. I firmly believe that this is bedrock and right, and that anyone who does not believe it cannot have probed deeply enough into the grounds of his moral beliefs. Kai Nielsen, Ethics Without God, 1990. Yeah, but here's the thing. Just because we as humans think it's evil, that doesn't make it evil objectively. It just means that we as individuals and as societies have decided on our own that we don't like it. And therefore, within our own particular sphere of social influence, we are going to call it evil as a subjective choice. Now, as I said before, that makes a lot of people uncomfortable because a lot of people want to know the truth, the whole truth, yada, 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 that kind of stuff. But in absence of that, and we don't actually have it, they just make up comforting stories in their heads to convince themselves that they've just got it all right, that they have the absolute truth, even though they demonstrably do not. And I can recognize that because of the society in which I live and the background which I have, I accept some of those things as true, and they are not demonstrably so. But if you go to other societies, specifically in this case, some places in the Middle East, where beating your wife, killing your wife, that's not illegal because they're basically seen as property. It's not wrong according to their society. It's very easy to see that these things are not universally true. But these people tend to be locked in their own heads, and they can't see the world outside of their little social echo chamber. And that's kind of a problem, wouldn't you say? Just about everybody watching this video has been indoctrinated into the idea that killing people is a bad thing, under certain conditions. Why? Because at least in the place where we live, it's bad for society and bad for individuals. However, as I said, there are places out there where kids are not indoctrinated into that. There are rules for the in-group and rules for the out-group, and that's true of all of us to some degree. But for some, the out-group has no rights whatsoever and can be treated however the hell anybody wishes. Why? Because they're seen as inferior. A big part of the human experience is ego. It's trying to build yourself up while tearing others down. Well, my sports team is better than your sports team. My country is better than your country. We're number one. We're number one. You know, that kind of stuff. This is a basic part of the human experience. It goes to religion too, of course. Well, my religion is right and your religion is wrong. You're going to go to hell if you don't believe in my God. That doesn't mean anything though, does it? Certainly nothing demonstrable. It's just how people behave. And sadly, when people stop understanding that it's just a part of the basic human psyche, they start to actually buy into the nonsense. And that's not usually a good thing. Again, atheists who are moral relativists could be wrong, but it seems difficult to insist that they are irrational in their acceptance of premise 2 of the moral argument, any more than we could insist that someone is irrational to believe that the external universe exists or that other people have minds. But see, this is the question that we really have to ask. They could be wrong, but how would we tell? What test can we put their position to in order to find out? What observations can we make that would determine whether or not it's right or wrong? And most people, they're not interested in any of that. Going back to sports for a second, we can look at which teams are actually the best. There's all kinds of metrics for doing that, and if people really wanted to follow the best team, they'd be going where the data showed them the best team lived. However, virtually nobody does that, do they? My parents were both big Cubs fans for their entire lives. They both grew up around Chicago. Therefore, the Cubs were their team, no matter how often they lost. Every single year, I'd have a bet with them that the Cubs were going to fail once again, And every single year they took that bet, and every single year they lost the bet. Now, I never actually held them accountable for paying up because it was a pretty obvious win for me. Now, they were wrong about the Cubs. It was, at least at the time, an objectively bad team. But they still supported their team for reasons other than wanting to follow the best team. They had an emotional attachment to the hometown team, and that's what kept them watching the games. And the same thing is true for moral realism. It's an emotional attachment that keeps most people there. They don't actually care if it's true or not, and this is true of religion and politics, lots of things where people adopt positions for feels and not for reals. They do all of this without ever thinking about it. And that's the problem. If they understood why they did things and acknowledged why they did those things, then maybe it wouldn't be so bad. If they said, but it makes me happy and that's why I'm doing it, great, fantastic. You go do you, I don't care. But they're saying, I'm doing it because it's true, because it makes me happy, but they don't say the last bit. That's the problem. If they could actually be honest about it, we might get rid of some of the ridiculous fanaticism that we see in the world today. However, most people don't understand it, and a lot of the ones who do, they just don't care. And where have we ever heard that one before? But if both premise 1 and premise 2 of the moral argument can be held independently for rational reasons, what is to stop a person from holding both premises of the moral argument simultaneously and consequently arriving at the logical conclusion that God exists? Nothing, it would seem. Except I've already shown that they aren't rational. Mostly, Neil's argument is based on a fallacy. Well, lots of people believe it, so it's just gotta be true. Welcome to Argumentum ad Populum. It doesn't matter how many people believe a thing. Lots of people believing a thing doesn't make it true. You need to learn to put your fifis aside and deal with the actual evidence at hand. And Neil, indeed most people, they neither want to nor seem remotely capable. And that's a problem, right? The only objection we might raise is that it is possible to have some overriding independent reason for us to believe that God does not exist. In philosophical parlance, such a belief is known as a defeater. And if you caught that like I did, you'll see the emotions in action. Because Neil, apparently, like most theists, they assume that God is the automatic answer to any question posed. They don't have to prove that God is real. They just sit there and wait for somebody to prove that God isn't. God is real until you prove it wrong. That's not how that works. Nothing is real until it is demonstrated to be real, and no one should believe anything is real until it is supported with verifiable evidence. God is not the automatic answer that the religious want him to be. And this is exactly why faith is so pointless. Faith makes you accept stupid stuff like this. So let's take an example with something like Bigfoot. If you just used Bigfoot to explain everything that you cannot otherwise explain, people are going to just look at you funny. Well, that tree fell down, therefore Bigfoot did it. There's a scratch on your car, therefore Bigfoot did it. You didn't get that job. Yeah, Bigfoot did that too. It gets really, really silly really fast, but for a lot of theists, if you just substitute the name for their gods for Bigfoot, they'd stop being so critical. Because, of course, their gods are real and do whatever the hell they want them to do. How could you ever doubt that? However, even if we grant that some people have such defeaters for theism, many people do not. But that's the problem, though, isn't it? Because if even one defeater exists out there anywhere, theism is wrong. He doesn't want to admit that, does he? In my experience, few people who are not avowed atheists would claim that they have sufficient evidence to believe that God does not exist. Except it's clear that Neil, like most theists, have no clue what atheism even is. Because the vast majority of atheists, they don't say that. We are not convinced, based on a complete lack of any kind of demonstrable corroboratory evidence, that any gods of any kind do exist. I don't believe is a perfectly valid option that the religious do not want to acknowledge. And we're going to see that again in a second, so let's read on. Even passionate atheists like Richard Dawkins would not claim to be certain that God does not exist. So a typical agnostic who hears the moral argument can rationally accept both premises and can rationally conclude that God exists. See, what did I tell you? He knows that he's wrong, yet he parrots it anyway because, well, fifis, of course. And that's still the problem, though, because just because somebody can't prove it doesn't exist, that doesn't mean that it does. You cannot rationally conclude that a God exists, any God of any kind, until you have the demonstrable evidence that said God actually exists. The moral argument doesn't mean anything. Like I said, you can plug in absolutely anything. If the flying spaghetti monster doesn't exist, then objective morals don't exist. Yada, yada, yada. Using God to appeal to people who already believe in God, that doesn't prove that God is real. This is just pure and painfully obvious confirmation bias. And I don't get the people who are too blinded by their faith to see reality. Conclusion. Belief in God can be based on emotion, but it can also be based on reason. In particular, it can be based on philosophical arguments for God's existence, such as the moral argument that I discussed above. Of course, this essay does not address or even attempt to address whether the moral argument is sound. I think it is, but if you identify as a skeptic, an agnostic, or an atheist, my more modest goal is to demonstrate the belief in God need not be irrational. Except none of that is actually true, and I've already proven that conclusively. This is just one more example of a theist using words, however they are the most convenient to use at the time. Belief in God isn't based on reason, as defined at the very beginning of the last video. It's, I have a reason, not reason itself, but a bald rationalization for why that specific individual really likes the idea that a God is real. But liking an idea doesn't make that idea true. If you don't care about truth, then what the hell are you doing? Because the religious, they don't care about truth. They care about emotion. They care about fifis. They just really want it to be true. And every time I see an article or a video like this where the bald rationalizations fly fast and loose, and I just take it all apart and show the fallacious nature of the claims, that doesn't really change anything for the religious, does it? They just keep believing because they were never interested in coming to the facts in the first place. They just really wanted to believe. Well, wanting to believe isn't enough. If you want to be rational, you have to be rational. But rationality here, let's be honest, that's not their actual goal. They just want to appear rational because I think they know that they should. I think they know that's what most people expect. Therefore, they put on the cloak of rationality, like it's a shirt that they can just wear on a whim and play rationality make-believe. They are not being actually rational. They're not actually employing rationality. They're just pretending. And that's the problem. Should that recognition be the end of our deliberation about God? Certainly not. If God does exist and is anything like the God described by Christianity, then he is more important than anything else in our lives. So I would encourage you to think deeply about these questions and not brush them aside. While admitting the rationality of theism is not a place to stop, it might be a place to start. And here again, we see the confusion between if and because. The time to believe a proposition is when it's been demonstrated and not one instant before. Of course, the religious don't care about that. I doubt Neil cares, although I really know nothing more about him than what I've read in this article. But it really seems to be all that I need to know because he's going through all the stupid tropes that we see from religious people everywhere. He really wants to believe, and he's just making excuses for why his beliefs have to be true, even though he's never produced a single shred of verifiable evidence to back up any of it. These are just all bald rationalizations. It doesn't actually demonstrate anything. It just provides emotional comfort to the believer so they can just go back out into the world and feel better when people shake their heads and laugh at the crazy things in their heads. Well, I'm being rational. No, you're not. You're just embracing even more bullshit stories that don't stand up to any kind of critical scrutiny, and I've just spent 2 videos proving it. It's not going to matter, though. The religious aren't going to care. But this is exactly where they're going wrong. This is all about feelings and appearances. It is never, ever, ever about truth and facts and evidence. And that's all any of us should care about. They should care if the things in their heads are actually and demonstrably true, entirely absent their faith in their fifis. They just don't. And I don't think we're ever going to get that through their heads because, as we know, caring about the real world, it's just not comforting enough. And the only thing they're really in it for is the comfort. But that doesn't make any of it true. And until they can understand that, they're pretty much a lost cause. Anyway, what did you think? Let me know down in the comments, and by all means, like and subscribe if you haven't already. And of course, share the video with others if you think that I've earned it. Doing these deep dives into theistic nonsense, it's not easy and it's not quick, and it's nice to feel appreciated. So anyway, until next time, think about what's going on in your head. It doesn't matter how it makes you feel, it only matters if it's real. Otherwise, you're just being like Neil, looking desperately for reasons to keep believing the unsupported slop. Don't be like Neil. He's not as bad as some people are, but he's still not what you really want to be.